The anomaly, at the edge of mapped space. The outer veil was supposed to be empty. That was the whole point of it. Grand Admiral Sithara Vel had been assigned to patrol this region of dead stars and cold dust for 6 months, and in all that time, nothing had happened. Not a rogue asteroid worth noting. Not a drifting piece of debris. Not even a decent electromagnetic storm to break the boredom. The outer veil was, by every measure, the Keth Empire had ever taken, the most boring stretch of space in the known galaxy. So when the sensor officer on the bridge of the Undying Dominion sat up straight in her chair and said, very quietly, "Admiral, I have something," Sithara Vel did not rush over. She finished the report she was reading, set it down on the console beside her, and walked across the wide bridge at a calm, measured pace. She had been an admiral for 30 years. She did not rush. She looked at the screen. She rushed. There was a ship out there. A single vessel, drifting through the dead center of the outer veil, moving at a slow and steady pace, as if it had every right in the world to be there. It was small, almost embarrassingly small by Keth standards. One of the Keth Empire's light patrol frigates could have swallowed it whole and still had room. It had no weapon signatures that the sensors could read. It had no shielding that registered on any known frequency. It was, by all appearances, barely more than a metal tube with an engine attached. But it was there. And it should not have been. "Run the transponder search," Sithara Vel said. Her sensor officer was already running it. The result came back in seconds. Nothing. The ship carried no transponder code recognized by the Imperial network. That network covered every registered vessel in 42 star systems, every species the Empire had ever made contact with, every ship ever built by a civilization that the Keth had catalogued in 5,000 years of expansion. 42 systems, thousands of worlds, hundreds of species. Nothing. "Run it again," she said. Same result. Sithara Vel stared at the little ship on the screen. It kept moving. Slow, steady, unbothered. She ordered a hailing signal sent on all standard frequencies. The Undying Dominion's communication array was one of the most powerful in the fleet. It could reach a ship on the other side of a star system without difficulty. The signal went out clearly, and the crew waited. The response came 3 minutes later. It was a language none of them had ever heard. The sounds were strange, short and clipped in some places, long and flowing in others. The ship's translation system, which could handle the dialects of over 200 species, sat there for a full 10 seconds before producing anything at all. Then it gave a single line of output, marked with a low confidence flag. Partial match detected. Cross-referencing archive. The cross-referencing took 3 hours. 3 hours during which Sithara Vel stood at the communications console and did not leave the bridge once. 3 hours during which the little ship continued moving through the outer veil at the same slow, steady pace, as if it was simply on a pleasant trip through the stars and had no idea a Keth warship was hovering nearby in a quiet state of growing alarm. When the archive result finally came through, Sithara Vel read it twice before she believed it. The language was a partial match to a dead signal file in the Empire's observation database, a file that had been opened 212 years ago by a scout team, and then quietly closed and forgotten. The file referred to a world in a distant spiral arm of the galaxy, a small, wet planet orbiting an ordinary yellow star. The scout team had visited, observed from a distance, noted that the inhabitants were primitive and posed no threat, and filed their report. The report included phrases like early industrial development and centuries from any meaningful space capability, and no further observation recommended at this time. The world had a name in the local tongue that the scouts had written down phonetically. Earth. Sithara Vel had never heard of it. None of her crew had either. She asked the ship's historian, who checked 3 separate databases before confirming that yes, the world existed in the archives, and yes, it was classified as a non-contact primitive world, and no, there was no record of any follow-up observation ever being conducted. She looked back at the little ship on the screen. It was still there, still moving, still unbothered. She made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. The ship was tiny. It was unarmed. It had come from a world that the Empire had personally assessed as harmless 2 centuries ago. The smart move, the diplomatic move, was to send a shuttle out and make formal contact, establish communication, find out why this little vessel was in Imperial space, and whether its people even understood where they were. It would be a good story to tell at the capital. The discovery of a newly spacefaring primitive species. Maybe they would be useful one day. Maybe they would be amusing. Either way, it was hardly a threat. She dispatched a diplomatic shuttle with a crew of 8, a translator, 2 diplomats, and 5 soldiers, who were told firmly by Sethara Vel herself to keep their weapons holstered and their mouths respectful. The shuttle crossed the distance between the 2 ships in 20 minutes and approached the human vessel at a slow, non-threatening angle. It signaled. The human ship signaled back. The shuttle moved in closer. And then it vanished from sensors. Not destroyed. The Undying Dominion's sensors would have detected an explosion. There was no explosion. No debris field. No energy discharge. The shuttle simply stopped appearing on any screen, on any frequency, as if it had been quietly erased from existence. The bridge went completely silent. Sethara Vel stood very still and looked at the place on the screen where the shuttle had been. Her hands were behind her back. Her face was calm because she was the admiral, and that was what admirals did, they stayed calm. But her mind was moving very fast indeed. The little human ship continued on its path through the outer veil. Slow. Steady. It did not speed up. It did not change direction. It did not send any communication explaining what had just happened, or why. It simply kept going, heading deeper into Keth space, as if the Undying Dominion were not there at all. As if 8 Keth crew members had not just disappeared. As if none of this mattered. Sethara Vel turned to her communications officer. "Get me a direct line to Imperial Intelligence," she said. "Priority 1. Tell them we have a situation in the outer veil." She paused. "Tell them it involves a world they stopped watching 200 years ago." She looked at the screen one more time. "Tell them I think that was a mistake." "What do you mean? They evolved." The message from Admiral Sethara Vel arrived at the Imperial Intelligence Directorate on a Tuesday morning, which was, by most accounts, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. The weather on Keth Primara was pleasant. The Senate was in session discussing trade routes. The Director of Intelligence, Mariv On, was on his 3rd cup of morning brew and reviewing a border dispute between 2 minor species that he found genuinely dull. He read the message once. He put down his drink. He read it again. Then he called his entire senior staff into the main operations room, locked the doors, and told them they would not be leaving until he had a full picture of what was happening in the outer veil and why a supposedly primitive backwater world had a ship in Imperial space that had just swallowed one of their diplomatic shuttles without leaving a trace. The senior staff, who were experienced professionals and had seen many strange things over the years, got to work. What they found over the next 18 hours was not reassuring. The archive file on Earth was real, and it was exactly as thin as Sethara Vel had described. A single survey report from 212 years ago, authored by a scout team that had done a flyby observation from outside the planet's detection range, spent approximately 3 weeks watching the surface from a distance, and concluded with the kind of lazy confidence that came from 5,000 years of being the most powerful civilization in the galaxy. The report was full of phrases that now made Mariv On's eye twitch. No advanced technology detected. Population engaged in low-level industrial activity. No evidence of unified planetary governance. Unlikely to develop meaningful space capability within the next millennium. The scout team had pulled their observation probes to save on maintenance costs. They had not gone back. Nobody had gone back. For 212 years, Earth had sat in the archive under the category of pre-emergent species, non-threat, observation suspended, and not a single person in the entire Imperial intelligence apparatus had thought to check in. There were thousands of worlds in the archive with similar labels. Most of them really were no threat. Most of them were still exactly where the scouts had left them, slowly figuring out agriculture or building their first crude machines. Checking on all of them would have been an enormous waste of resources. Most of them were not, apparently, Earth, because Earth had not stayed where they left it. What Mariv On's team was able to piece together over the following days, from intercepted signals, recovered trader testimonies, and fragments of data gathered from the missing shuttle's last transmission before it went dark, was a picture of a species that had done something the Keth Empire had never seriously considered a possibility. They had moved fast. Unbelievably fast. In the time the Empire had not been watching, the humans of Earth had nearly destroyed themselves at least twice, once through environmental collapse, and once through a war fought with weapons powerful enough to make parts of their planet temporarily uninhabitable. They had come extremely close to wiping out their own civilization. Marev-On noted this detail and set it aside, because what happened next was the part that mattered. They had survived. And the surviving had changed them. A species that had stared into the face of its own extinction and dragged itself back through sheer, stubborn, collective effort did not come out the other side soft. It came out unified in a way that species who had never faced that kind of crisis simply were not. The humans who crawled back from the edge of oblivion had a civilizational memory baked into their culture, never again be caught unprepared. It was in their stories. It was in their institutions. It was in the way they built things and planned things and thought about the future. 60 years after those dark decades, they had achieved faster-than-light travel. Marev-On stopped reading at that point and sat back in his chair. Faster-than-light travel in 60 years. From near extinction to the stars in 60 years. He thought about how long it had taken the Keth to develop similar technology. He decided not to think about it too hard, but it got worse. When the humans reached the stars, they did not do what every other species the Empire had ever encountered did. They did not start broadcasting. They did not send out signals of greeting. They did not try to make contact with the wider galaxy and announce their arrival. They went quiet. For the next 40 years, humanity sat in space and listened. They collected signals. They studied languages. They mapped the political structure of the galaxy with a patience and thoroughness that made Marev-On genuinely uncomfortable, because he was realizing that while his empire had been running its affairs as it always had, eyes watching in every direction it cared about, there had been another set of eyes watching from a direction nobody had thought to look. And then, quietly, without drawing attention, the humans had started making friends. 4 minor species near human space had made contact with humanity before anyone else in the galaxy knew humanity existed. These were small, peaceful civilizations that the Empire considered unimportant, barely worth cataloging. But they were in human territory, and the humans had approached them carefully, diplomatically, and with what every account described as a remarkable amount of genuine patience. No demands, no threats, no showing up with warships. Just contact and trade. And the slow, steady building of relationships. It took Marev-On's team another full day to find the detail that made the room go very quiet. The humans had known the Empire was there for 30 years. They had been tracking Keth ship movements, studying Keth communications, and building a detailed picture of Keth military capability and patrol patterns for 3 decades, and the Empire had not once detected them doing it. The Senate was informed. The debate that followed was loud and went on for a long time. Half the senators wanted immediate diplomatic engagement. The other half wanted a show of force, a fleet large enough to make clear that the Keth Empire did not appreciate unknown species wandering through its space unannounced. The show of force faction won. 200 warships were assembled. It was a fleet that could glass a planet if ordered to. It was a fleet that had ended wars before they properly started, simply by showing up. No species in the galaxy had ever looked at a Keth battle fleet of 200 ships and chosen to do anything other than immediately and completely cooperate. The fleet crossed into the outer edge of human-claimed space on a clear heading and broad sensors, making no attempt at stealth, because stealth was not the point. The point was to be seen. The point was to be overwhelming. The point was to remind this strange, unrecorded species of precisely where it stood in the order of the galaxy. The response came within minutes of the fleet crossing the border. A single calm message, in perfect Keth, with no detectable accent. The translation was flawless. Not just fluent flawless. The kind of fluency that came from 30 years of careful study. Please hold your position. Admiral Chen will be with you shortly. War Prince Durathek, commanding the fleet, read the message 3 times. His communications officer asked if he should respond. Durathek looked at his 200 warships on the tactical display. He looked at the empty space around them. His sensors showed nothing out there. Just stars. No, he said slowly. We will wait. He was not sure why he said that. He told himself it was patience. He told himself it was the professional courtesy of a commander who could afford to be calm. He did not tell himself the truth, which was that something about the message, something about the tone of it, the quiet confidence of it, the complete absence of fear in it, had made a cold feeling settle into his chest that he could not quite explain. He waited for Admiral Chen. Admiral Chen. She appeared on the holographic display 11 minutes after the message was sent, and War Prince Durathek's first thought was that there had been some kind of mistake. The figure standing in the projection field was small. Not small for an alien species, small even by human standards, which his intelligence briefings had described as a medium-sized bipedal species of average build. She looked old, with white hair pulled back close to her head, and lines on her face that spoke of a great many years and a great many decisions. She was wearing a dark uniform, with small markings on the collar that his briefing notes said indicated high rank. She was holding, in one hand, a small ceramic cup that was producing a faint curl of steam. She was drinking something hot. During first contact with an Imperial battle fleet of 200 warships, War Prince Durathek, she said, in clear and perfect Keth, with a small nod of her head. My name is Mei Chen. I hold the rank of Admiral in the Terran Stellar Command. Thank you for waiting. Durathek had prepared a speech. It was a good speech, formal, appropriately threatening, and structured according to the standard Imperial First Contact Protocol for situations involving unauthorized species in Imperial adjacent space. He had practiced it twice on the journey here. He forgot most of it. You are in violation of Imperial boundary protocols, he said, which was not the opening line of the speech, but was at least in the speech somewhere. This space falls under the jurisdiction of the Keth Empire. Your vessel, and any others operating under your authority, must immediately cease all movement and await Imperial processing. Admiral Chen listened to all of this with the expression of a person who was being told something they already knew. She took a sip from her cup. I understand, she said. And I'd like to discuss your concerns in full. Before I do, I want to ask you one question, and I want you to understand that I'm asking it in good faith, not to be difficult. She looked at him with calm, dark eyes. Did your fleet pass through the Velhari corridor on your approach here? Durathek blinked. The Velhari corridor was a long stretch of navigation space named after the Keth officer who had mapped it centuries ago. It was a standard route through this part of the outer systems. Of course, the fleet had used it. It was the most efficient path. Yes, he said. What does that have to do with anything? Admiral Chen set her cup down. She did it gently, the way a person sets something down when they are about to give their full attention to something else. I was hoping you hadn't, she said. I'm sorry for what comes next. Durathek opened his mouth to ask what that meant. Every screen on the bridge of his flagship went dark at the same moment. Not damaged dark. The systems were still running, the consoles were still lit. But external sensors had stopped feeding data. Navigation had gone quiet. The weapons targeting system, which had been running a passive background lock on nearby space as it always did, had simply stopped working. Not an error message. Not a malfunction warning. It had stopped, as if someone had reached into the system and turned off a switch. Around him, his bridge crew was staring at their consoles with expressions ranging from confused to frightened. Reports came in from across the fleet. Within seconds, 200 ships experiencing the same thing simultaneously. External sensors, down. Communications between ships still functioning on internal channels. But all outward-facing systems had gone quiet. What is happening? Durathek said, loudly and to no one in particular, because none of his crew had an answer. The holographic display was still working. Admiral Chen was still there. She was watching him with an expression that was not unkind. Your sensor systems use a frequency modulation pattern that we've known about for a while, she said simply. We built something that can interrupt it. We apologize for the lack of warning. We had hoped this situation could be avoided entirely. What have you done? Durathek said. "I've made your fleet safe," she said. And then, because apparently she felt that sentence needed more context, she added, "Safe for everyone." Then the shapes appeared. They came out of the dark around the Keth fleet, emerging from nothing, from empty space that the sensors had shown as empty, because the sensors were no longer working, but that had not, it turned out, actually been empty at all. Human vessels, running without any active emissions, had been sitting in the dark around the Keth fleet the entire time. Not a handful, dozens of them, appearing one after another as they activated their running lights, each one moving slowly into visible range, as if stepping forward to be counted. They had been in the Velhari corridor when the Keth fleet passed through it. They had been there the whole time, invisible, matching speed, tracking every ship, occupying every angle of approach. The Keth fleet had crossed into human space inside a net it could not see, and had been flying deeper into that net for hours without knowing it. Durithek stood on his silent bridge and watched the human ships appear around him and felt something he had not felt in 30 years of military command. He felt like a young soldier, again young and very far from home, and very much aware that he did not fully understand the situation he was in. The battle, such as it was, lasted 11 minutes. He would not call it a battle afterward. In the reports he filed, he was not sure what to call it. No Keth ship fired a shot there was nothing to fire at, because the weapon systems had no lock, no target data, no functioning sensor input. The human ships moved through the Keth fleet with practiced precision, and one by one, ship by ship, additional systems went offline. Propulsion, emergency communications, docking bay controls. All of it switched off, not destroyed, not blown apart, just stopped, as if the human vessels passing nearby were carrying a signal that turned things off when it passed close enough. When the 11 minutes were over, 200 Keth warships were floating silently in space. Not a single hull was cracked. Not a single Keth crew member was hurt. The ships simply could not move, and could not communicate beyond their internal channels, sitting in place like 200 very large and very expensive pieces of drifting metal. Admiral Chen's holographic image was still on Durithek's display. She looked exactly as she had at the beginning of the conversation, calm, unhurried. There was a faint expression on her face that he spent a long time afterward trying to identify, and eventually decided was closest to the expression of a person who had hoped to avoid doing something and was quietly unhappy that circumstances had required it anyway. "I'm going to send repair crews to each of your ships," she said. "They'll have your systems back online within a few hours. I'm also sending food. I understand your journey here was a long one. Please tell your crew not to be alarmed by the repair teams. They won't be armed." Durithek stared at her. "We are also sending back your diplomatic shuttle," she continued. "The crew is fine. They've been well looked after. There is a written message with them from our first contact office, an apology for the delay in returning them. That was not handled as well as it should have been, and we regret it." The shuttle that had vanished from Setharavel's sensors weeks ago, that had triggered this entire situation, that had quietly been held somewhere while 200 warships were assembled and sent to make a point. They had been fed and looked after, and were coming home with a written apology. "What do you want?" Durithek finally said. Admiral Chen picked up her cup again. "To talk," she said. "Properly this time. Not like this." She glanced, very briefly, at the stillness around them, the silent fleet, the dark screens, the human ships sitting in patient formation, around 200 powerless warships. "When your ships are moving again, go home. Tell your empire what happened. And when you're ready, when your leadership is ready, we'd like to sit down at a table and have a real conversation." She looked at him directly. "We've been waiting a long time for this," she said. "We can wait a little longer." The holographic display clicked off. Durithek stood in the quiet of his dead bridge for a very long moment. Then he sat down in his command chair, which was the only thing left that he could do, and he waited for the human repair teams to arrive. 200 years of silence. The fleet came home slowly. 200 warships moving at reduced speed, many still running on partial systems, all of them carrying crews who had spent several very quiet hours sitting in disabled ships, while small groups of cheerful and polite human technicians moved through their corridors fixing things. It was, By every measure, the most humiliating event in the history of the Keth Empire. The ships that returned were undamaged. The crews were unharmed. And somehow that made it worse, because there was nothing to be angry at, no destroyed hulls to point to, no casualties to mourn, no act of violence to condemn. The humans had simply turned the fleet off, and then fixed it, and sent them home with food. At the Imperial Intelligence Directorate, Director Marev Own did not sleep for 4 days. He was not a man who panicked. He had run intelligence operations for 22 years and had encountered situations that would have broken less experienced minds. He was calm, methodical, and deeply reluctant to admit when something surprised him. But the events in the Velhari corridor had produced in him a feeling that he could only describe as the ground shifting under his feet, and the only way he knew how to handle that feeling was to work. So he worked. He pulled every scrap of data the Empire had on the humans. The original scout report, the frequency analysis of their ship's drive signature from the Outer Veil encounter, the partial signal intercepts collected over years of border region monitoring, which had never previously been flagged as significant because nobody had known there was a species out there producing them. The recovered memory logs of the diplomatic shuttle crew, all 8 of them, healthy and slightly confused about why they had been gone for weeks when they felt certain it had only been a few days. He read all of it, and then he had his analysts read all of it, and then he asked them to compile everything into a timeline. The timeline, when it was finished and printed and laid out across the long table in the operations room, was the most troubling document Marev Own had ever read in his life. The early years were almost hard to look at. The human world had come within a very small margin of destroying itself. Climate systems had destabilized over the course of a century of industrial activity, producing large-scale environmental collapse in several regions of the planet. Before that crisis could fully resolve, a global conflict had broken out, a war fought with weapons of a type the Keth had encountered in the histories of other primitive species, crude but devastating in sufficient numbers. Parts of the planet had been made temporarily uninhabitable. Populations had been displaced on a massive scale. The analysts had flagged this section of the timeline with a note suggesting that humanity should have failed here. Several models, run through the Directorate's predictive systems, agreed. A species hitting 2 simultaneous existential crises within such a short period of time had, historically, tended to fragment, collapsing inward, losing the organizational capacity needed to address the problems, eventually declining over the following centuries into something smaller and simpler. Humanity had not fragmented. It had done something the predictive models apparently did not have a good framework for, which was to treat the crises as a shared problem, requiring a shared solution, hold together under conditions that should have broken it apart, and come out the other side with a civilizational scar that functioned less like a wound and more like a lesson. The lesson, as best as Marev Own could interpret it from the cultural signal analysis, was this: the universe was not safe. Preparation was not optional, and never again would humanity be caught looking in the wrong direction. 60 years after the worst of the crises, they had built their first faster-than-light vessel. Marev Own paused on this part of the timeline for a long time. The Keth Empire had taken centuries to develop FTL travel, aided by encounters with other species who had gotten there first. The humans had done it in 60 years, starting from scratch, and the drive signature of their ships suggested they had not copied anyone else's design. They had developed something different, something that the Empire's engineers, given a week to study the sensor data from the Outer Veil encounter, had described as elegant in a way that made the lead engineer visibly uncomfortable, because she was not used to looking at alien technology and feeling that way about it. Then came the 40 years of silence. This was the part that Marev Own kept returning to. 40 years during which humanity had ships, had FTL capability, had every reason to make contact with the wider galaxy, and had chosen not to. During which they had, instead, listened, patiently and systematically gathered signals from across the galaxy, decoded languages, built profiles of species, mapped political boundaries, identified power structures. They had assembled, in 40 years of quiet work, a picture of the galaxy that rivaled anything in the Empire's own intelligence archives. They had known about the Keth Empire for most of that time. They had known about its size, its military structure, its patrol patterns, and its history. They had read enough Keth to understand the language perfectly. They had built a file on the Empire that Marevon, when he finally accessed the copy recovered from the diplomatic shuttle's data storage, found professionally thorough and quietly accurate, including several assessments of Keth military weaknesses that made him put the document face down on the table and stare at the ceiling for a moment. The 4 allied species near human space had been approached after the silence period ended, but before any formal contact with the Empire. Small civilizations, peaceful ones. The humans had approached them carefully, over years, and built relationships based on trade and genuine exchange, rather than the standard imperial method of arriving with warships and explaining the options. Those species were, by all accounts, sincerely loyal to humanity in a way that species who had been absorbed into the Empire usually were not. And then the hardest detail of all. Buried in the recovered data from the shuttle, in a file that had been partially encrypted and required 2 days of work to open, was a human strategic planning document. It was dated 19 years ago. It was titled, In Plain Terran Script, Framework for Keth Integration into Terran Allied Space Contingency, Plan 7. Marevon read it from beginning to end, without stopping. It was not a war plan. There was no section on how to destroy the Keth Empire. There was no list of targets, no strategy for conquest, no plan for occupation or political replacement. Instead, it was a detailed, step-by-step analysis of how a confrontation with the Keth Empire would likely unfold, what the Empire's probable responses would be at each stage, and how to navigate each of those responses toward a single specific outcome. That outcome was not Keth surrender. It was not Keth destruction. It was Keth partnership. The document had predicted, with uncomfortable accuracy, that the Empire would eventually notice humanity. It had predicted the diplomatic shuttle would be sent, and outlined how the shuttle crew should be treated and returned. It had predicted the Senate would vote for a show of force, rather than diplomacy. It had predicted the size and composition of the fleet within a reasonable margin. It had outlined the Velhari corridor ambush and described exactly the kind of restraint that should be shown. No casualties, full repairs, food, the polite message because the goal was not to win a fight. The goal was to demonstrate something specific. The goal was to show the Keth Empire that humanity was not a threat to be destroyed. The goal was to make them understand that humanity was a force they could not control, could not frighten, and could not move, and then, from that position, to offer them something they had never been offered in 5,000 years of being the most powerful civilization in the galaxy. An equal. Marevon set the document down. He looked around the operations room at his analysts, who had been quietly watching him read for the last hour. They wrote this 19 years ago, he said. Nobody answered. They had all read it already. They knew, he said, not angry, not accusing, just working through it out loud, the way he always worked through things. They knew we would come. They knew what we would do. They planned for all of it. He was quiet for a moment. And the plan was never to fight us. No, sir. His senior analyst said carefully. The plan was to make us want to sit down at a table. Yes, sir. Marevon picked up the document again. He looked at the title. Framework for Keth Integration. Not defeat. Not surrender. Integration. He thought about the 200 ships that had just come home. He thought about Admiral Chen, small and old, and holding her cup of tea, watching Durathek's fleet, with the calm of someone who already knew exactly how it was going to end, because they had written it down 19 years ago and practiced for it ever since. He thought about a species that had nearly destroyed itself, survived, and then spent a century and a half being very, very careful. Set up the summit meeting, he said. Whatever the Senate decides, set it up. We are going to that table. He stood up from his chair. And someone get me more information on Admiral Chen. The station had no name. It had been built specifically for this meeting, constructed in the space between Keth and human territory, positioned so that neither side had to cross into the other's space to reach it. It was a neutral place in the most literal sense, a ring of metal and glass floating in empty space, belonging to no one, claimed by no one, existing purely so that two civilizations could sit in the same room, without either one having the advantage of standing on their own ground. The Keth delegation arrived first. This was not entirely intentional, but it was not an accident either. Grand Admiral Sethara Vel, who had been chosen to lead the delegation, had decided that arriving first was the correct thing to do. She was not entirely sure why she felt that way. She told herself it was protocol. It might have been, in some part, that she needed a few minutes inside the station before the humans arrived, to stand in the conference room and look at the chairs and the table and the blank, clean walls, and simply get used to the idea that this meeting was actually happening. She was the one who had found the human ship. She was the one who had dispatched the diplomatic shuttle that disappeared. She had been the first officer in the Empire to know that something was very wrong about the category of non-threat, observation suspended. She had been the first to understand that a mistake had been made, and now she was sitting at a table to try and work out what came next. The human delegation arrived 12 minutes later, which Sethara Vel noted was exactly on time according to the schedule they had agreed on. Not early, not late. On time with a precision that she was beginning to recognize as a human characteristic. Admiral Mei Chen walked through the door of the conference room, in the same dark uniform she had worn during the holographic contact with Durathek, with the same small collar markings, and the same white hair pulled back from her face. She was shorter in person than she had seemed even on the hologram, smaller than any Keth officer of equivalent rank, which meant something culturally significant that Sethara Vel was still working out. She was accompanied by 4 people, a younger officer who served as her aide, a translator who had not been needed in any of the previous interactions, but was present out of formality, and 2 others who carried no visible rank markings, and who were introduced simply by name. Chen looked at Sethara Vel across the table, and offered something the intelligence files had identified as a human greeting gesture, a brief upward movement of the mouth corners. Not quite a smile, something more restrained. "Grand Admiral," she said. "Admiral Chen," Sethara Vel said. They sat down. The first 2 days of the summit were, by any honest accounting, difficult. The Keth delegation had brought a list of formal demands that the Senate had insisted on, including, they were the opening position. Everyone knew they were the opening position. And the process of setting them aside without anyone losing face took the better part of a full day. Sethara Vel had expected this, and had prepared for it. The humans listened to every demand without interrupting, asked a number of clarifying questions that were so specific and so well informed that 2 of Sethara Vel's junior delegates visibly blanched, and then offered counter-positions that were reasonable without being weak. The Keth pride was a complicated thing. It had been built over 5,000 years of being correct, of being the most powerful force in the galaxy, and being right about that every time it was tested. Having that certainty removed was not something that happened easily or quickly or without pain. Several moments in the first 2 days came close to breaking down entirely, when one side or the other said something that landed wrong, and the room went cold and silent. What kept the talks from collapsing, Sethara Vel would say later, was Chen's consistency. The human admiral had a way of handling the most difficult moments that was so quiet it took Sethara Vel several hours to identify what she was doing. When the room went cold, Chen did not push. She did not press the advantage of the moment, did not lean forward and apply pressure to the fracture. She would set whatever she was holding down on the table, and she would wait. Sometimes she asked a question about something unrelated, a small, human-sized question about food, or the length of the journey, or whether the station's temperature was comfortable for Keth physiology. Small things. And the cold would slowly warm again, and the conversation would find its way back. On the 3rd day, the formal demands had been set aside, and the real conversation began. It was Chen who started it. She leaned forward in her chair, which was the first time she had done so in 3 days, and she spoke without looking at her notes. "We want to tell you something," she said. "Not as a negotiating position, just as a fact that we think is relevant to all of this." Sethara Vel looked at her. "Go on." "We almost didn't make it," Chen said. "Humanity. We came very close to ending ourselves. And when we came through the other side of that, we spent a long time thinking about why it had happened. Not just the specific causes, but the deeper reason. Why does a species that can see a problem coming still fail to stop it?" She was quiet for a moment. "We decided the answer. In our case, was that we had no one to hold us responsible. No one outside ourselves watching and saying this is going wrong. You need to do better. Sitharavel said nothing. She was listening. You have ruled this part of the galaxy for 5,000 years, Chen continued. And the species around you have been afraid of you for 5,000 years. That's not partnership. That's not even stability, not really. It's a held breath. An empire that is never challenged does not improve. It only maintains until it can't. She looked at Sitharavel directly. We don't want your throne. We are not here to replace you at the top of a hierarchy. We are here because we think the hierarchy itself is the problem, and we are one of the few civilizations in this galaxy that has both the capability and the standing to say that to you without it being a fantasy. The room was very quiet. You could have destroyed us, Sitharavel said. It was not an accusation. It was just true. Before we knew you existed, you had 30 years of watching us. You knew our patrol patterns, our fleet dispositions, our communication systems. You could have struck first. Yes, Chen said. Why didn't you? Chen looked at her for a long moment. There was something in the human's expression that Sitharavel could not fully read, but that felt genuine. Felt like the face of someone who had thought about this question many times and had a real answer to it. Because winning a war was never the goal, Chen said. Winning a war would have given us territory. It would have given us resources. It might have given us security. For a while. She paused. What we actually want is a galaxy we don't have to be afraid of. And you can't build that by destroying the biggest power in it. You have to change what the biggest power in it is doing. The summit continued for 4 more days. At the end of it, a provisional treaty was signed. It was not a treaty of submission or conquest. It was not the kind of treaty the Keth Empire had ever signed before, because it was a treaty between equals, one that acknowledged both sides had territory, interests, and rights that the other was required to respect. It established a joint communication framework. It opened 3 trade routes. It created a process for resolving disputes without either side defaulting to military threat. It was, in the long history of the Keth Empire, the first document of its kind. Sitharavel signed it on behalf of the Empire. Her hand was steady. She had made peace with what she was doing somewhere around the 3rd day of talks, when she had stopped thinking about it as a defeat and started thinking about it as something else. She was not sure yet what word to use for it. The human word that Chen had used was partnership, and Sitharavel was still deciding whether she believed it. But she thought she might. After the signing, the delegations shared a meal, a human tradition for marking agreements, which the Keth side had been briefed on and had agreed to observe. The food was a mix of Keth and human dishes, prepared by staff who had clearly worked hard to find things that both species could safely eat and might actually enjoy. Sitharavel ate something the aide described as a grain dish with slow-cooked vegetables, and found it unexpectedly good. Chen sat across from her, and they talked, for the first time, without it being a negotiation. Small things. The length of the journey to the station. What the outer veil looked like, from the bridge of a ship. Whether the cold and deep space felt different when you had been in it as long as either of them had. The kind of things that people talked about. On the shuttle home, Sitharavel stood at the viewport for a long time. Her aide stood beside her, and did not speak until the station had shrunk to a point of light behind them, and the stars had settled back into their familiar patterns. What do you think of them? The aide asked. The humans. After all of it, Sitharavel was quiet. She thought about the little ship in the outer veil that had started everything. She thought about Durathek's fleet, sitting silent and powerless in the Velhari corridor. She thought about Chen's voice, calm and direct, explaining things without cruelty, asking for things without weakness. She thought about a document written 19 years ago by people who had already decided how this would end, and had made it end that way, one careful step at a time. They had us in their sights for 30 years. She said finally. They could have struck first. They had every advantage. They knew more about us than we knew about ourselves. She watched the stars. And they used all of that preparation, all of that knowledge, not to destroy us, not to take what we had, but to make us sit down at a table. Her aide was quiet for a moment. Why would they do that? Sithara Vel turned from the viewport. Because they didn't want an empire, she said. They wanted neighbors. She walked back toward the center of the shuttle, and after a moment her aide followed, and the stars continued to move past the viewport in silence, the way they always had. Though somehow the galaxy they sat in seemed, to anyone looking carefully, to be very slightly different than it had been before.